Welcome to Aircraft, your gateway to thrilling HFY sci-fi stories where humanity stands strong among the stars. Here, you'll experience epic encounters with alien civilizations, moments of human courage, intelligence, and the unstoppable spirit that makes humanity unique. Every story on this channel is narrated by a real human voice, not AI, bringing you a more authentic and immersive storytelling experience. If you love sci-fi adventures and stories where humanity proves its worth in the universe, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
There's a planet at the edge of the Varith Expanse, a world the Galactic Compact cartographers labeled HR 7714 and promptly forgot about because nothing strategically interesting was supposed to live there. No rare minerals. No hyperspace codeders. No civilizations worth cataloging. Just a mid-sized rock with a molten core, an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere that was technically a slow-burning chemical reaction, and gravity heavy enough to make most species nauseous after 40 seconds of exposure. The Dreth Armada spent 11 years trying to conquer it. They failed, not because of orbital defense platforms, not because of allied fleets, not because of any weapon the Compact had ever classified, or any strategy any Dreth admiral had encountered in 300 cycles of warfare. They failed because the things that lived on HR 7714, the things that called it Earth, did not understand the concept of a correct loss. The Dreth Armada withdrew on a Tuesday. The creatures of HR 7714 called it a victory and immediately began arguing about who deserved credit for it. My name is Velshanka, Senior Integration Specialist for the Compact's Resettlement and Cultural Liaison Office, and I was assigned to escort one of those creatures through the process of enrolling in a standard Compact educational facility. I was told it would be straightforward. I want to find whoever told me that. The report on Specialist Grade Mira Vasquez arrived on my desk with 17 attachments for security flags and a personal note from Director Orith that read, simply, good luck. Director Orith had served through the Kell Wars. He did not use that phrase lightly. I read the file in order because that is how Velshan process information, taxonomically, hierarchically, in the sequence that produces the most complete picture before action is required. I'm a patient species by nature. We have 12 subdialect for the concept of waiting, and we experience time in overlapping registers, what my people call Velthar, the awareness of a moment and its eventual consequence simultaneously. It is a gift. It allows us to be calm. The file on Mira Vasquez made it difficult to be calm. Age, 17 years by Earth's solar calendar, which, converting to standard Compact cycles, made her approximately 14.3. A child, by every species reckoning I had ever encountered. Service record, 4 years embedded with Terran Ground Forces, 9th Reclamation Unit, operating in the Brennan Corridor during the Dreth occupation. Classified operations, redacted. Classified operations, redacted. Classified operations, redacted. Medical record, 2 fractures, healed per Earth biology to a density reportedly exceeding the original bone. 1 concussive event, 1 listed under the clinical category environmental toxin exposure, which I cross-referenced with the Compact's chemical database, and then stopped cross-referencing because the substance in question should have dissolved her from the inside out over approximately 4 hours. She had apparently experienced this for 6 hours. Survived, and then, per the field report, complained primarily about the smell. There was a photograph in the file. She was not tall. That surprised me. The Dreth survivors who had encountered her unit described something considerably larger in their testimonies, which I had assumed was combat trauma distorting memory. The photograph showed a girl, and she was a girl. The proportions were undeniably juvenile, with dark hair cut short on one side and longer on the other, like the cut had been started for a practical reason and then abandoned. A diagonal scar ran from her left eyebrow toward her ear. Her expression in the photograph was completely neutral, not the careful neutral of a diplomat trained to conceal. The neutral of something that has been so many places where neutrality was mandatory that it had become a resting state. Her eyes were the detail I could not stop returning to. Brown, by human color classification. But there's a Velshan concept, Sevran, that describes the look of a creature that has been prey and survived it so many times that it has reclassified itself. Not hunter, not prey, something that exists beyond the binary, in a category that has known natural predators because no natural predator has been fast enough to matter. Her eyes were Severan, in a 17-year-old child. I closed the file. I opened again. I closed it again. Then I prepared for pickup. The transport station at Compact Integration Hub 7 was designed to be welcoming. I want to be precise about this. It had been engineered by 17 committees across 9 species to communicate safety, neutrality, and accessibility. The lighting was calibrated to be comfortable across 12 different visual spectrums. The architectural proportions accommodated 43 known species body plans. There were information panels in 214 languages. There were staff members selected specifically for their calm dispositions and their training in cross-cultural emotional de-escalation. Mira Vasquez walked through the arrival gate, looked at all of it, and her first coherent sentence to me was, "Where are the exits?" Not hello. Not thank you for meeting me. Not even the standard Compact greeting that the integration prep team had apparently spent 6 weeks teaching her. Exits. There are 4, I said, because I had been trained to answer the actual question being asked. 2 primary, 1 service, 1 emergency. The emergency one has a pressure lock. It takes 11 seconds to cycle. She looked at me for a moment. I'm not a visually intimidating species. Velshan are tall, nearly 2 meters by Earth measurement, with a thin, elongated frame for upper limbs in 2 hinge pairs and skin that cycles through a range of pale bioluminescent tones depending on our autonomic state. I was at that moment cycling a calm amber. Professional composure. She said, "Good. The service exit or the emergency one?" For what purpose? Just for knowing. I noticed that her bag, a single, worn duffel with repairs to the strap done in 3 different materials, was positioned on her left shoulder with the opening facing inward and slightly forward. It was not how you carried luggage. It was how you carried something you needed access to without looking like you were reaching for it. "Service," I said. "3rd corridor, past the environmental integration bay." She nodded once. And then, as if that entire exchange had been a formality she needed to complete before she could relax, which I would kind of understand it was, her posture shifted. Not much. Perhaps 4 degrees. But the particular configuration of her shoulders changed from something that had a word in Velshan, Threvel, meaning the stance of a creature that is currently deciding whether you are a threat, to something slightly less categorizable. "You're my integration specialist?" she asked. "Velshanki. You can call me Vel, if you prefer. Most humans abbreviate. Vel." She tried the sound. "Okay. Vel, do you have a school schedule?" I had expected many opening questions. The dormitory, the other students, the cultural adjustment process, the dining protocols, even, perhaps, some emotional processing about leaving her planet for the first time, which the integration prep file had flagged as a potential area of difficulty. "Not the school schedule." "I do," I said. "Can I see it?" I handed her the data slate. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took to memorize it. I would discover later that this was not a figure of speech, and handed it back. "What's the threat assessment for the student population?" The question was asked in the same tone that a person might ask about the weather. Informational. Practical. No particular urgency. I became aware that my bioluminescence had shifted from amber to a pale, uncertain yellow. "There is no threat assessment," I said carefully. "It is a school." "Yeah," she said. "I know." She picked up her bag. "Which way to the dormitories?" The Compact Integration Academy on Hub 7 serves students from 41 species, ranging in age from the equivalent of 12 to 19 Earth years, with a faculty of 63 instructors across disciplines from astrophysics to cross-cultural communication theory. It had been in operation for 212 compact cycles. It had a good reputation. Several heads of state were alumni. It had never had a human student before. This was not, technically, because humans were unwelcome. The Compact welcomed all species that met the baseline criteria for sapient classification and had signed the accord. Earth had signed the accord approximately 8 months ago, in the immediate aftermath of a Dreth withdrawal, in a ceremony that I am told involved a human tradition of photographing the event and then arguing in public about whether the photographs were flattering. The delay in human enrollment was partly logistical, curriculum adjustments, dietary accommodations, the minor chaos of adding a 214 language information panel, a 215th language, and partly, if I am being accurate, because no integration specialist had yet volunteered. I had not volunteered either. Director Orth had assigned me. The reasoning, per his official memo, was that my background in high-stress diplomatic contexts and biological anomaly cataloging made me the most suitable candidate. The unofficial reasoning, which he communicated through the specific way he avoided meeting my eyes when he said it, was that everyone else had read the file and declined. I thought at the time that this was an overreaction. I was still in the transport station. The dormitory room was a standard single-occupancy unit, sized for a mid-range humanoid frame, which humans fell within. There was a sleeping platform, a study console, storage, an environmental control unit, and a viewport that faced the station's central garden atrium, a design choice meant to provide psychological comfort through exposure to organic growth. Mira Vasquez walked in, stood in the center of the room for roughly 4 seconds, and then moved the sleeping platform 18 centimeters to the left. That puts it closer to the wall, I observed. Yeah, the original position was centered to maximize, I know. She was already checking the viewport latch, not looking at the garden, checking the mechanism, how it opened, whether it could be opened from outside. It is sealed from outside, I said. Environmental integrity. She finished checking it anyway. Then she stood at the viewport and looked at the garden, and for a moment, just a moment, something in her expression did something I did not have a word for yet. Not quite softness, not quite grief. Something that seemed to remember what it was like to look at growing things without calculating whether they provided cover. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then she turned around and said, "What time does the cafeteria open?" "Fifth bell, standard cycle." But I should explain the dietary situation. Human biology requires different nutritional. I brought food, she said, unzipping the duffel. She had approximately 9 days worth by my estimate. Compact sealed protein packs, but also, and this was the detail that lodged in my cognitive architecture and would not leave, 3 items wrapped in what appeared to be cloth. Not plastic, not standard compact storage material. Cloth, stained slightly, worn at the edges. She set them on the storage shelf with a care that was disproportionate to their apparent value. I did not ask. She caught me not asking and said, "My grandmother's tortillas. They don't travel well. I'll probably have to throw them out by tomorrow." A pause that was not quite a shrug. Figured I'd have them tonight. There was a word in Velshawn, Orville, that described the act of keeping a thing past its usefulness because the usefulness was never the point. We used it for ceremonial objects, for the tools of ancestors, for things whose value was not material, but could not be adequately named in any other category. I did not say this. I said, "Orientation begins at second bell tomorrow. I'll meet you here." Okay. She was already arranging things on the sleeping platform with a precision that I recognized later as someone who had spent years knowing exactly where everything was in the dark. "Hey, Vel." "Yes." "The other students, were they like?" I considered the student population. The Threx delegation, with their hierarchical social structure and their tendency to assess new arrivals by immediately establishing dominance. The Pelian cohort, gentle but so socially complex that human emotional directness tended to read as aggression to them. Rokothis, the second-year student from the collective, who had opinions about Earth's Accord signing that she had shared loudly and often. The general social ecosystem of 41 species in proximity, adolescent by their various standards, navigating the perpetual chaos of cross-cultural development. "Complex," I said. She looked at me with those Severan eyes. "But manageable," I added. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back to her things. I walked to the door. Something made me stop, some Velthar awareness of the moment and its eventual consequence, and I turned back. She had taken out the cloth-wrapped tortillas and set one on the edge of the sleeping platform. Just sitting there, not eating it, just present, like a reminder of something she was carrying forward into whatever came next. "Vasquez." She looked up. "The Threx students will attempt to assess your social rank on the first day. They do it to everyone. It presents as rudeness, but is actually their form of introduction." A pause. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller. "So don't punch them," she said. "Ideally not." "Got it." The almost smile again. "Thanks, Vel." I left. In the corridor, my bioluminescence had gone a color I needed a moment to identify. It was the pale green of Velorvin, the Velshan word for the specific unease of witnessing something you do not have adequate categories for, and knowing the categories are going to have to change. I walked back to my office. I started building new categories. The first day of orientation was structured, as all Compact Integration Academy orientations were, around a principle of graduated exposure. New students were introduced to the facility in stages: common areas first, then academic zones, then social spaces, with integration specialists present throughout to manage any cross-cultural friction. The principle was sound. Mira Vasquez had been in the main orientation hall for approximately 40 seconds when Rokathis made a comment. I should describe Rokathis. Second-year student, collective species, which meant she was a neural cluster organism. Approximately 30 individual polyp nodes organized into a cooperative cognitive unit, presenting in a roughly humanoid configuration for compact interaction purposes. Highly intelligent, socially assertive, had, on 3 separate occasions, filed formal complaints about the Compact's decision to extend Accord membership to Earth on the grounds that a species that had required 11 years to repel a Dreth invasion by attrition and apparent suicidal refusal to process loss did not meet the threshold for strategic rationality. Her comment, in Standard Compact, was, "The human looks smaller than the reports suggested." It was not aimed at Mira specifically, or it was aimed at the room. The collective manner of speech was often directional in a way that didn't map neatly onto individual conversation. I was already formulating the standard integration specialist response about cultural communication differences. Mira Vasquez looked at Rokathis. Looked at her for exactly as long as it took to assess something. Then, she said, in Standard Compact, and her accent was not perfect, but her grammar was meticulous, which told me she had learned it from text rather than speech, probably in a field situation where text was more reliable. "You're the one who wrote the 3 complaints about Earth's Accord membership." The orientation hall went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when something unexpected has happened. Rokathis's node cluster shifted. "You read the Compact policy proceedings?" "I read everything in my file," Mira said, "including the attached objections." A pause, the kind that had weight in it. "Your arguments were well constructed," Mira added. "The one about strategic rationality thresholds. I didn't agree with the conclusion, but the logic was solid." Rokathis was quiet for a moment, which for a collective organism capable of processing 30 cognitive threads simultaneously meant she was either very calm or very not calm, and there was no external way to tell which. Then, she said, "You didn't agree with the conclusion." "No, because you believe your species meets the threshold." "Because," Mira said, "I think the threshold is wrong." But that's a longer conversation. She turned back to the orientation map she'd been given. I was watching the Threk students, 3 of them, in a cluster near the environmental display, and they were watching Mira with the particular stillness that meant they were recalibrating. The Threk's social hierarchy engine had been running since she walked in, and it had just hit a data point it didn't know what to do with. She hadn't established dominance. She hadn't submitted. She had done something that didn't have a category in Threk's social architecture. She had engaged the established authority's challenger on intellectual terms, complimented the challenge, and redirected without conceding. There was a Threk's word for this, I recalled. Ketvar. It translated loosely as the move of something that doesn't know the rules, and therefore makes a move that the rules don't cover. It was either an insult or the highest possible compliment, depending on the context. The lead Threx student, tall, grayscale with the formal neck frills that marked third-tier social ranking, caught me watching and made a small gesture. In Threx social language, the gesture meant, "Your assessment of this new factor?" I made the gesture back that meant, "Insufficient data?" Continuing to observe. He made the gesture that meant, "Agreed." Mira was studying the orientation map with complete attention, as if none of the preceding 45 seconds had happened. Her left hand, at her side, was tapping a slow, absent rhythm against her thigh. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 3 again. I had seen that pattern before in the file. It was mentioned once in a field report by her unit commander. Vasquez taps when she's processing. Not anxiety. Thinking. I noted this. I did not know yet why I was noting it. The Velthar awareness of a moment's consequence, perhaps. Some sense that the small data points were going to matter more than the large ones. On the orientation map, she had already marked the locations of all 4 exits. In pen, on the provided digital map. In actual ink, I looked at this for a moment. She had carried a pen from Earth. There was something in that detail that I could not immediately categorize, and so I did what Velshawn do when confronted with uncategorizable data. I filed it, I labeled the file pending, and I moved forward into the day. The day had considerably more pending files to generate. By the end of the first week, I had added 23 items to the pending file. I will list a representative sample, because the accumulation is important. Item 4. Mira Vasquez arrived at Advanced Astrophysics on day 2 with a handwritten question about the Dreth Fleet's navigational algorithms during the Brennan Corridor campaign. Not a theoretical question, a specific one, containing variables that suggested she had observed the algorithm in operation from inside the corridor. Professor Veltana, who had published the definitive compact academic paper on that very algorithm, stopped mid-lecture and asked Mira where she had obtained the data set. Mira said, counting their approach vectors. Professor Veltana did not speak for 9 seconds. 9 seconds is a long time for a Velshawn. We process at high speed when we are calm. She was not calm. Item 7. In cultural comparative studies, the assigned exercise was to describe a tradition from one's home culture in terms that another species could understand without their own cultural context. The other students described festivals, coming-of-age ceremonies, communal dining practices. Mira described the human tradition of making things for people you love when you cannot give them anything else. Specifically her grandmother making tortillas by hand, in a kitchen on a death world where flour had to be rationed, and the making itself was technically inefficient, and doing it anyway because the act of making was the point, not the product. She described it in standard compact, in 11 sentences. The Pelian students, who experience emotion as a chemical shift in their gill fluid, and whose composure is legendary among compact species for its imperturbability, had to excuse themselves from the room for 4 minutes. They did not explain why. They came back and did not look directly at Mira for the remainder of the class, which in Pelian social language was not avoidance. It was reverence. Item 11, the cafeteria incident. I should address Item 11 in detail, because it became a documented event. The cafeteria at Integration Academy Hub 7 was designed with 41 species dietary needs accommodated across separate preparation zones with cross-contamination barriers. It was also like all spaces where 41 species of adolescents gathered daily, a social arena. Seating was nominally unassigned. In practice, territorial patterns had established themselves over years of operation, with the force of unwritten law. Mira sat, on her 3rd day, at the intersection table, the one between the Threx section and the Pelian cluster, which was not a neutral zone. It was a contested zone, historically unclaimed because to claim it was to invite friction from both groups simultaneously. No first-year student had sat there in recorded academy history. I arrived at the cafeteria to find her there with her compact issue meal tray, eating what I now recognized as a peace offering from the kitchen staff. They had made an attempt at a human grain product, and reading a data slate. On one side, 3 Threx students were conferring in rapid, low-frequency vibration. On the other, 2 Pelian students had stilled in the particular way that Pelians still when they're trying to process an anomaly without reacting to it. The entire cafeteria had the quality of a hell breath. Mira looked up from the data slate and said to the Threx student nearest her, "This seat bother you?" In Threx social language, that question was not a question. It was an invitation to establish terms. The lead Threx. I recognized him as Velthankar, 3rd-tier rank, whose name I recorded earlier as simply the lead Threx because I had not yet processed how much he would matter to this account. Looked at her for a long moment. His neck frills were at partial extension, which was assessment mode. "It is an unusual choice," he said. "Yeah," she said. "I like unusual choices. You are aware of the territorial history of this location?" I read the social mapping report in my integration file. Velthankar's frills shifted, full extension, which I had never seen paired with that particular tone of voice, and which the combination of meant something I had to cross-reference with 3 separate Threx cultural databases before I identified it as reluctant respect for audacity. "You read your social mapping report?" he said. "I read everything." A pause. His frills settled to a relaxed mid-position, which in Threx body language was the equivalent of extending a hand. I am Velthan Carr, he said. Mira Vasquez. She went back to her data slate. You can sit down if you want. He sat down. The cafeteria breathed. I was standing near the environmental barrier with my observation log open and no idea what to write in it. Item 17 was harder to categorize. It happened on day 5 during the free period between afternoon academic sessions and evening seminar. I found Mira in the maintenance corridor behind the Easter dormitory wing. She was not doing anything that violated any regulation. She was sitting on a section of conduit housing with a small, battered notebook, actual paper carried from Earth, and she was drawing. I should note, I had not gone looking for her. My integration schedule called for a check-in at the common room at the end of free period. The maintenance corridor was not on my route. I was there because I had developed a habit, which I did not examine too closely, of noting where Mira was not when I expected her to be somewhere, and then finding where she actually was. She was drawing the viewport at the end of the corridor. Just the shape of it. The frame, the darkness beyond, the small smear of light from a distant star cluster. She was drawing it with a concentration that was entirely different from the concentration she brought to tactical assessments or academic material. There was no scanning, no cataloging. She was just looking at the light and making a mark that corresponded to it. I watched her for approximately 12 seconds before she said, without looking up, "You breathe at a specific frequency, Vel. I know you anywhere in the dark. My apologies." "Don't be." She made another mark. "I'm not hiding. I didn't think you were." She looked up then, at the viewport, not at me. I used to draw in the field, when things were quiet. My CO thought it was a waste of time. Sergeant Osei said it was how I stayed right in the head. A pause. Osei was smarter. I noted the name. It appeared twice in her file, both times redacted. I did not ask, "What do you draw?" I asked instead, "Whatever's there." She looked at the mark she'd made. Back home, it was a lot of rubble. Burned infrastructure. Dreth gun emplacements. A beat. They had a particular shape, their gun emplacements. Like a clenched hand. She made a small gesture with her own hand, closing it. I drew a lot of those. Figured if I kept drawing them, I'd stop dreaming about them. Did it work? The corner of her mouth. That almost smile. "Not really," she said. "But the drawings are good." She went back to the viewport shape. I stayed because she hadn't told me to leave, and the maintenance corridor was quiet, and my Velthar awareness of consequence was very loud in a way I was not yet prepared to translate. After a while she said, "What do your people draw?" "We do not draw exactly. We have a practice called Velshar. It is more like mapping. We render our emotional states as spatial diagrams. Relationships between feelings, distances, connections." She looked at me for the first time. "You map your feelings?" "In a sense." "Can I see one?" No non-Velshan had ever asked me that. It was a deeply private practice. The equivalent, I thought, of her showing me the notebook. I extended my upper right limb and shifted the bioluminescence into a pattern, a specific configuration of amber and pale blue that represented, in Velshar, the concept of uncategorizable, but significant. It was not my most complex emotional map, but it was honest. She looked at it for a long time. "That's the one you make when you're looking at me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." She looked back at the viewport, made one more mark in the notebook. "That's okay," she said. "I probably make a face like that when I'm looking at this place." She closed the notebook. "It's a lot." "Yes," I said. "It is." Item 23 happened at the end of the first week in Advanced Tactical Theory, which was a course technically outside Myra's assigned curriculum. She had added it herself through the elective request portal, which Integration Academy students were entitled to use, but which first-year students rarely did in their opening week because the social and academic adjustment period was generally considered enough to manage without adding extra course load. The instructor, Commander Dothhealer, was a retired compact defense fleet officer, a massive Kothrian, roughly the shape of a boulder with additional features, who had been teaching tactical theory for 40 cycles and who had, in those 40 cycles, developed a fixed opinion about the cognitive limitations of various species' strategic thinking. His opinions were not, as a rule, complimentary. He had expressed his opinion about Earth's 11-year defensive campaign against the Dreth in the Academy's staff proceedings, where the summary of his view was, "An extended war of attrition is not strategy. It is failure to develop strategy compensated for by endurance." On Myra's first day in his class, he opened with a case study, The Brennan Corridor Campaign, years 7 through 9, from the dress strategic perspective. He was, I learned later, not aware he had a human student enrolled. He was aware approximately 4 minutes into the lecture, when Mira said, the Dreth made 17 navigational corrections in year 8 alone. That's not a siege pattern. That's uncertainty. Commander Doth Healer turned, looked at her. His species communicated threat assessment by the arrangement of the 3 external cartilaginous ridges above their optical sensors. All 3 of his were at full elevation. You have a source for that observation? He said. Primary observation, she said. I was in the corridor in year 8. The class was quiet. 17 students, 12 species, all of whom had been enrolled in tactical theory long enough to know that Commander Doth Healer did not like his case studies interrupted. You were in the Brennan Corridor, he said. At age 13, she said. The ridges did something I had not seen them do in 40 cycles of instructional footage. They dropped, completely flat, which in Kotharian body language was not anger. It was recalibration. Continue, he said. So she did. For 22 minutes, Mira Vasquez, age 17 Earth years, first week Integration Academy student, holding a battered paper notebook in her lap, walked the class through the Dreth tactical errors in the Brennan Corridor from the perspective of someone who had been on the ground watching them happen in real time. She did not use operational terms. She did not use compact tactical notation. She used the vocabulary of someone who had learned strategy by surviving it. Specific, spatial, visceral. She talked about the shape of a Dreth formation the way you'd talk about something you'd seen from a specific angle, in specific light, under specific conditions of fear and attention. She talked about the moment in year 9 when the Dreth commander changed their approach pattern, and how the ground forces had known before the strategic analysts did, because the change in pattern produced a change in sound. The engine harmonics of their atmospheric craft shifting frequency as they reoriented, and how the unit had repositioned based on a sound before a single sensor reading confirmed it. She did not, at any point, indicate that this was extraordinary. Commander Doth Healer did not move for the duration. After she finished, he was quiet for a long time. His ridges were still flat. He looked at his data slate. He looked at the case study he had been presenting, which was now, clearly, insufficient. Dismissed, he said, to the whole class. The class filed out. Mira stood and collected her notebook. Vasquez, he said. She turned. Next week's case study will require a primary source. A pause, if you are willing. She looked at him for a moment. Sure, she said. She left. In a corridor outside, Velthankar was waiting. He had been to class, I realized, and had heard all of it. He fell in a step beside her, frills at the relaxed mid-position that had become, apparently, his default configuration in her presence. I watched them from the doorway. Did you know he was going to use that campaign? Carr asked her. I read the syllabus, she said. You read the syllabus, and you enrolled anyway. Figured someone should say it right. They walked down the corridor. Neither of them looked back. I stood in the doorway of the tactical theory classroom and watched them go, and my bioluminescence was doing something I had never done involuntarily before, rapid cycling between amber and that pale green Velorvan. And Commander Doth Healer, who was still standing at his lectern, said without looking up from his data slate, Your charge is not what the file indicated. No, I said. The file indicated a trauma case requiring specialized reintegration support. Yes. He looked up. His ridges were at a configuration I had to think about. Neutral elevation, slight inward cant. In Kotharian professional language, it meant I was wrong, and I am noting it for the record. It is the other way around, he said. I did not respond immediately because I was not sure he was wrong, and I was not sure of very much at that moment, and the corridor outside was empty now, just the hum of the station's environmental system and the distant sound of 41 species of students going about the ordinary chaos of an academy afternoon. She drew the gun emplacements, I said, to stop dreaming about them. He looked at me. It didn't work, I said, but she said the drawings were good. He was quiet for a moment. What does that mean, he asked. I thought about it. I'm still working on that, I said. I left him there. I had a Velshar to draw, and for the first time in a long time, it was going to take up the whole page. The second week began with what the Academy's social monitoring system flagged as a potential cross-cultural conflict event, which was the system's way of describing a situation that didn't fit any of its existing conflict categories and, therefore, defaulted to the most alarming option available. What had actually happened was this. Three collective students, Rokathis and two of her cohort, had cornered Mira in the Eastern Study Hall and issued what, in collective social protocol, was a formal intellectual challenge. In their culture, the correct response to a well-argued position you disagree with is to request a structured debate before witnesses. The request itself carries enormous social weight. It is an acknowledgement that the other party's intellect is worth engaging. To most non-collective species, it presented as three organisms of gelatinous neural cluster configuration advancing on a lone human student and making demands in a highly formal register. The social monitoring system had been invented by a committee with no collective members. I arrived to find the situation already resolved. Mira had said yes. The debate was scheduled for the following afternoon in the common hall on the question of whether the concept of strategic rationality thresholds for accord membership was a valid metric or a category error. Rokathis had spent the previous 8 months building the case that it was valid. Mira had, by my count, 8 days in which to form an opinion. I found her that evening in the maintenance corridor again, notebook open, but not drawing. Writing. You're preparing, I said. Trying to. She looked at the page. She's good. Her argument structure is solid. I can't out-logic her on the technical points. Then what will you do? She was quiet for a moment. On the page in front of her was not an outline of logical counterarguments. It was a list of moments. Specific, named, dated moment from the war. I could not read the handwriting from where I stood, but I could see the structure, each entry brief like a field notation. Coordinates of time and event rather than place. Ro's argument is about rationality, Mira said. What constitutes a rational response to existential threat? She's been measuring us against a standard and finding us irrational. She tapped the pen against the page. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause. But she built the standard from species that have never had a Dreth fleet in their atmosphere. It's not a universal standard. It's a model of rationality from a universe where that hasn't happened yet. She looked up. I'm not going to argue she's wrong, Mira said. I'm going to argue she's working from incomplete data. I looked at the list of moments. And you're the data, I said. The almost smile. Smaller than usual, but more certain. Yeah, she said. I guess I am. She went back to writing. I sat on the conduit housing across from her, and the maintenance corridor hummed around us, and somewhere in the station the evening cycle was shifting the light through the viewport from the cold white of artificial day toward the warmer amber of artificial dusk, and the distant star cluster was doing what it had been doing for several million years, burning patiently at a distance that made it look like a mark in a notebook. Mira wrote, I began my Velshar because the map of what I was feeling was getting complex enough to need the space. Outside, somewhere, Hub 7 turned in the dark. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The Common Hall of Integration Academy Hub 7 could seat 312 students across 41 species in relative comfort. By the time I arrived on the afternoon of the debate, it held 270, which was every student currently on the station not in mandatory academic session, plus 11 faculty members who had evidently decided their time was better spent here. Commander Dothieler was in the 4th row. He had not been scheduled to attend. He was sitting with his ridges at that flat, recalibrating configuration. He had brought his data slate and was, I noticed, not looking at it. Professor Veltana was in the 3rd row, which was where I would have expected her. She and I exchanged the small Velshan gesture that means, we are both observing the same anomaly. The format was standard collective debate structure. Opening statement, 3 rounds of exchange, closing argument, witnessed by a panel of 3 neutral parties. The panel consisted of a Threx senior student, not Velthankar, who had recused himself on the grounds of what he described, in admirably accurate Threx social language, as conflict of established bias toward one party, a Pelian faculty advisor, and a compact administrative representative who handled the recording. Rokathis opened. She was, as I had understood from her policy documents, excellent. Structured, precise, internally consistent. She had spent 8 months building this argument, and it showed. The strategic rationality threshold was a coherent concept, derived from 300 cycles of compact membership data, validated against the behavior of species that had successfully navigated existential threat within what she defined as acceptable outcome parameters. The data was real. The methodology was sound. The conclusion, that a species which had sustained an 11-year defensive war rather than seeking negotiated resolution was demonstrating systemic strategic irrationality, followed from the premises. She sat down. The hall was quiet. Mira stood up. She was wearing her Integration Academy uniform. It fit almost correctly, slightly long in the sleeve because the sizing algorithm had estimated her measurements conservatively, and she had not adjusted it. The scar from her eyebrow to her ear was visible. Her hands, at her sides, were still. Not the stillness of nerves. The stillness of someone who had stood in much louder places and learned to be very quiet inside them. She said, "I want to start with something Rokothis, and I agree on." The hall processed this. It is not, in collective debate protocol, how openings work. The concept of strategic rationality is real, Mira said. It describes something meaningful. The idea that a species' decisions under threat should be evaluated for internal logic, and that the accord should be granted to species capable of operating within a cooperative galactic framework. I think that's right. I'm not here to argue against the framework. Rokothis's node cluster shifted. She had, clearly, prepared for several opening gambits. This was not any of them. My argument, Mira continued, is that the framework was built from data that doesn't include us, and that the resulting model has a gap in it, and that the gap is not about rationality. It's about what rationality looks like when the variable you haven't accounted for is. What if the species choosing to fight has already calculated the cost and chosen it anyway? She opened the notebook. Not to read from, I could see from my angle that the pages were facing her, but she wasn't looking at them. They were there like the tortillas on the sleeping platform. A presence, not a reference. Year 3 of the Dreth occupation, she said. My family was in a reclamation zone in what used to be called northern Mexico. The Dreth tactical doctrine for occupied zones was resource extraction followed by population reduction to a sustainable labor threshold. That's not my language. That's theirs from the captured command documents. Sustainable labor threshold. She paused on those words, just for a moment, just long enough. By year 3, the compact strategic projection models, I've read them, they're in the public access archives, had determined that continued resistance was mathematically inadvisable. The force disparity was real. The models were accurate. If you ran the numbers, the humans fighting the Dreth in year 3 were fighting a battle they were going to lose. The hall was very still. We knew that, Mira said. We're not enumerate. We could read a force disparity the same as anyone. The people fighting in my family sector in year 3 knew they were behind on every metric that a strategic rationality framework would cite. She looked at Rokothis, and they fought anyway. Not because they miscalculated, because they had calculated something your model doesn't have a variable for. She looked down at the notebook for the first time, not reading, looking at something in her own hands. My grandmother made tortillas, she said, by hand, in a kitchen with ration flour during a war we were losing on paper. It took her 45 minutes every time. It was by any operational metric a waste of time and resources. I asked her once why she bothered. A beat. She said, because this is how we stay us. The notebook closed. That is not irrationality, Mira said. That is a calculation. It just measures something your model doesn't have a unit for. The variable is, what are we trying to survive as? Not just whether we survive. As what? Because a sustainable labor threshold is survival. It's just not survival as us. She looked at Rokothis. Your model is correct for species that calculate survival as a binary, alive or not. It doesn't account for species that calculate survival as a specific configuration. Us specifically. The version of us that makes things for people we love. That draws when things are quiet. That argues about who deserves credit for a victory before the ships are even gone. The corner of her mouth moved. We are terrible at a lot of things. Tactical efficiency. Numerical self-assessment. Accepting correct losses. She said the last 3 words with a specific weight because she knew she had read everything. That Threlvas was the Velshan concept Rokothis had referenced in her second complaint document. But we are exceptionally good at deciding what we are not willing to stop being. She sat down. The notebook went back into the pocket of her slightly too long sleeve. The hall did not make a sound. I was aware peripherally that my bioluminescence had gone a color that I did not have a mapped category for, and that it was visible, and that I was not making any effort to control it. Rokothis was still. The collective stillness of 30 cognitive nodes, all processing the same input simultaneously, and finding that none of them had the prepared response for it. The 3 rounds of exchange happened. I could not summarize them adequately. They were fine, competent. Rokothis was still precise. Mira was still specific. But the moment had already happened, and both of them seemed to know it, and the exchanges had the quality of 2 people completing a ritual that had already concluded. The closing arguments happened. The panel conferred for 4 minutes, which was notable because collective debate panels typically conferred for 40. The result was declared. No consensus on the original motion. The strategic rationality threshold remained a subject for further study, with a formal recommendation that the Accord membership criteria be reviewed with specific attention to the gap in the existing data model. It was technically a draw. Velthan Carr, beside me, said very quietly in his own language, not standard compact, his own language which he knew I had studied, the phrase that translates as, "She moved the ground under the argument." I said in Thrax, yes. He looked at me, surprised that I'd understood. Then he looked at Mira, who was accepting the congratulations of approximately 11 students from 4 species with the expression of someone who had just finished a thing that needed doing and was ready to move on to whatever came next. "She's going to be interesting to watch," he said. "In standard compact this time. She has been interesting since she walked through the arrival gate and asked about the exits," I said. His frills moved in the specific configuration that meant of course she did. That evening I found her on a roof access platform. It was not technically a designated common space. It required an environmental suit for full exposure, which she had obtained through the equipment locker on a standard checkout, and she was sitting at the outer edge of the platform in the suit, looking at open space. I put on the second suit and sat beside her. We did not talk for a while. The star field was exactly what it always was, vast, cold, indifferent, populated at its visible distances by things that did not care whether any of us were here or not. From the roof platform, you could see the soft curve of the station's outer hull, and beyond it the particular black of space that was not emptiness but depth, full of things too far away and too small to resolve. "You did well today," I said. "I said what was true," she said. "That is often the harder task." She was quiet for a moment. Her breath was visible inside the helmet, the slight condensation of it on the interior surface, fogging and clearing with each exhale. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When you assigned to me, was it voluntary?" I considered the honest answer and decided it was the only answer she would accept. "No," I said. She nodded, unsurprised. Everyone else read the file and declined. I said, "I figured." She looked at the star field. "I've had that my whole life. The file that makes people decide not to be in the room. A beat. It's useful, actually. The people who stay anyway are always the right ones. I processed this. Is that a test?" I asked, not on purpose. She turned to look at me. In the suit, in the dark with the star field behind her, her face was lit only by the helmet's internal illumination, a soft, neutral white that made the scar at her eyebrow look like a deliberate mark. "You stayed. I was assigned. You stayed tonight," she said. "Nobody assigned you to the roof." I did not have an immediate response to this. My Velthar awareness was operating at full capacity, and the consequence it was pointing toward was so large that my mapping instinct wanted to render it immediately, in full detail, using the entire bioluminescent range. I settled for letting my suit's external panels show the amber and pale blue of uncategorizable but significant. She looked at the pattern. "There is again," she said. "Yes." I looked it up, she said. "The Velshar documentation in the compact cultural database. That color configuration. And it's listed as, and I'm reading this very carefully because I don't want to get it wrong, the emotional map of an encounter that has exceeded existing categorical frameworks and is in the process of generating new ones." "That is an approximate translation," I said. "Is it accurate?" "Yes." She looked back at the stars. "Good," she said. "Me too. There's a thing I have learned in the time since, and I am writing this from a distance of 18 months because I wanted enough perspective to do it accurately about what Mira Vasquez did at Integration Academy Hub 7. She did not conquer it. She did not dominate it. She did not demonstrate human superiority in the ways that Dreth propaganda about Earth had suggested, and that some of the more fearful compact political commentary had amplified. She just was there, fully, specifically, inconveniently, persistently there. She asked about exits because she had learned that knowing exits was how you stayed alive, and staying alive was how you stayed you. She sat at the intersection table because the contested space was the one that needed someone in it. She enrolled in tactical theory because the record was wrong, and someone needed to say it right. She drew the shape of the viewport because she was still learning that some things were worth looking at without calculating the cover they provided. She debated Rokathis and didn't win and didn't lose and moved the ground under the argument and went back to the maintenance corridor afterward and drew the pattern of light from the star field through the viewport and didn't show it to anyone because some things are just for being made. She ate her grandmother's tortillas on the first night, alone in her room, and throughout the cloth they'd been wrapped in and kept the cloth. I know because I found it on her storage shelf 3 months later, folded precisely behind the data slates. I did not ask. She caught me not asking and said, "The cloth still smells like her kitchen." I have a Velshan concept for that. Orville. Keeping a thing past its usefulness because the usefulness was never the point. I had thought of it on the first day and filed it, and now I took it out of the file and I gave it to the new category I'd been building. The new category was large. It kept needing more space. At the end of the first semester, the Integration Academy held its annual cross-cultural symposium, a formal event at which students presented something from their home culture to the assembled student body. The format was old. Most presentations were informational, a historical overview, a performance, a demonstration of craft or tradition. Mira signed up. I did not know what she was going to do until she walked to the front of the common hall, fuller than it had been for the debate, because word had traveled in the way it does in closed communities, the way that news of something genuine travels faster than anything engineered, and set a small portable heating unit on the table. She had flour, compact acquired, but earth-strain wheat, which she had apparently sourced through the dietary accommodation program with assistance from the kitchen staff, who had been, over the course of the semester, developing a complicated affection for her. She had water, salt, a small amount of fat. She had her grandmother's hands, which were her own hands, which were, looking at them as she began, not the hands you'd expect from the file. They knew this. The motion was muscle memory, older than the war. She made tortillas. She made them in front of 240 students from 41 species, and she did not explain what she was doing while she did it. She just did it in the particular silence of someone doing something they know by heart. The slight pressure of the heel of the hand, the quarter turn, the recognition of the moment when the dough had become the thing it needed to be. When they were done, she tore them into pieces. She handed them out. She did not say, "This is a human tradition." She did not say, "This is what we fight for." She did not explain the 11 years, or the Brennan corridor, or the sustainable labor thresholds, or her grandmother's kitchen with its ration flour. She did not give a speech. She just handed a piece of bread to a Threx student with ceremonial neck frills who had never touched a human-made thing, and to a Pelian advisor whose gill fluid had been shifting chemistry for 20 minutes, and to Rokathis, who took it in one of her manipulation nodes and held it for a long time without moving, and to Commander Dothhealer, who ate it in one motion and then sat very still with his ridges at that flat, recalibrating angle. She handed one to me. I held it. I am not certain what the correct thing to do with a piece of bread is in the Velshan tradition, because we do not eat in the way that produces bread or requires it. I am certain that putting it down felt wrong. So I held it for the duration of the presentation, and when the hall was clearing, I was still holding it. Mira looked at me from the table where she was packing up the heating unit. "You're going to hold it forever," she said. "I don't know what else to do with it." "You eat it." "I don't process grain products." "I know." She looked at the piece in my hands. "You could just keep it for a bit, until it's time not to." Orville, I thought. "Yes." "Okay," I said. She picked up her things. Velthan Carr was waiting at the door, frills at the relaxed mid-position that had long since become his permanent configuration around her. They walked out together, already talking about something else, some class assignment or social navigation question, the ordinary business of people who have accepted each other into their category of known and trusted. I stood in the empty common hall. The heating unit was gone. The flour and water were gone. The thing she had made, already distributed, already going wherever bread goes, was gone. But the hall was different than it had been before she made them. Not dramatically, Not in any way a social monitoring system would flag. Just different in the way that a space is different when something real has happened in it. A kind of residue of having been here. Evidence of presence. I have been thinking in the 18 months since about how to write the Velshar for that moment. The emotional map of what I was processing as I stood in that room with a piece of bread I was going to keep until it was time not to. The map has an unusual configuration. It is not entirely in categories I had before Mira Vasquez walked through the arrival gate and asked about the exits. Some of it is in the new categories I built for her, Sevran, Velorvan, the updated understanding of Orville. Some of it is in concepts I am still developing, which may or may not have words in Velshan, which may require new words, which is, I have come to understand, the natural consequence of encountering something genuinely new. The largest part of the map, the one that takes up the most space, the one I keep returning to when I sit down to render it properly, does not have a name yet. It is the feeling of watching a creature who has survived everything and carries that everything forward into the next room. The scar in the notebook and the cloth that still smells like a kitchen, and proceeds to exist in the next room so fully, so specifically, so persistently themselves that the room reorganizes around them. Not because they forced it, because presence, genuine and complete, does that. I'm going to need more space. Mira Vasquez completed her first year at Integration Academy Hub 7 with academic results that the system categorized as exceptional, which is the Academy's classification for students who exceed the standard curriculum's capacity to adequately challenge them. She enrolled for the second year. On the morning of her second arrival, having spent the summer on Earth in what she described to me as completely normal, mostly fine, occasionally alarming terms, she walked through the Hub 7 arrival gate, and the first thing she said to me was, "Where are the new exits?" "They haven't changed," I said. "I know." The almost smile. More certain than it used to be. More present. "I'd just like to check." She walked toward the dormitory. The same bag on the same shoulder. The same forward-facing opening. She stopped halfway down the corridor and turned back. "Well, yes. You're still here." "I was assigned," I said. The smile came fully then. For the first time since I had known her, it arrived completely. No hesitation, no qualification, no almost. It was just there in her face, specific and real. "Yes," she said. "You keep saying that." She turned and kept walking. My bioluminescence did every color at once, briefly, in a configuration that did not map onto any existing Velshar. I would need a new word for it. I started building one. It took a while, because the thing it needed to describe was large. But I am, as I have mentioned, a patient species. I had time.